Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to Most Writers Are Fans, the podcast that explores the intersection between writing and fandom. My name is Terry Bartley, and I'm your host. So for today's episode, I'm having an interview with Arden Coutts. Arden is a romance writer. I met them at Lavender Con, and it's another sort of fun queer interview about how to write trans characters. We get really into that, and also just kind of like building friendships and how to market yourself and all those kind of things. We get into a lot of the nitty gritty. Like that's not unusual for this podcast, but we really do in this interview. So dig into it. I guess get the best of what this podcast does, which is having serious conversations, but also in a way that feels more commiserating and lighthearted than just sort of railing about them. So stay tuned for that. And also it was just fun to talk to Arden. He's a really fun person to talk to. So for my intro today, I want to talk a little bit about editing because I've mentioned in some recent episodes that I've been sort of in the thralls of editing my novel. And I've just made it through maybe a fifth of it so far. And this experience feels very different from editing my last book. And I just wanted to chat about this a little bit because I think that it's interesting. So whenever I did the last book, I wrote a bunch of short stories, and then I just sort of put them together, and then I sent them to a developmental editor, basically, is what I went through and made them seem okay. Sent to a developmental editor, they gave me notes back, and I just kind of figured out what was sort of missing and what I needed to add, and just kind of switch that around. And then I wrote a bunch more stories, basically, to kind of fill it out. And that was a cool process. I really enjoyed having an editor and kind of following notes and learning how to make my writing better. I absolutely feel like I became a better writer in the process. But this is so different because this novel that I'm editing right now, I wrote it it's the first thing I wrote. So I wrote it years ago. I started writing it truly forever ago. But I started actually legitimately writing it maybe 2018, 2019. And it was a great experience. I enjoyed writing it. It really is sort of what got me into the spirit of writing and sort of this journey that I'm on now. But it took me a while to write. I kind of shelved it once I started doing all the tyranny of the face stuff, just because I wanted to learn this process of self-publishing and promotion and all of these things that I've been learning over the course of the past year and a half or so, a couple years. And now that I'm sort of so I've sent this to an editor. The editor is a friend of mine. She was in the last episode. Kirsha is my editor. And Kirsha Fox, great author. If you haven't read her stuff yet, check her out. She's incredible. But it's been really interesting to kind of delve into this book again. First of all, I've talked about this in other interviews, but I just want to say it again. It is so cool to go back and read your stuff again. Things that you were proud of, that you put a lot of work into. And then to read through it and say to yourself, wow, this is pretty good. It's so self-affirming to kind of be able to go back and acknowledge that, because in the moment, hard to acknowledge that. It's hard to sort of see that when you're kind of in the thick of it. But what's interesting about this is I've actually been through a number of edits with this book before. I did beta reading already. I changed things for the beta readers. I have kind of had a couple of different ideas of what to do with this book. This is this is probably the third or fourth round of full edits. So it's not it's not been tweaked before, but it's really interesting this time to edit it because it kind of feels wow, this is it's finally coming together. This feels like something is sort of getting fine tuned, because truly with Tyranny of the Fae, there were things that were this full thing is missing. This thing is missing. We need to put it in there. And this book is really not that so much. It's more of just little bits and pieces. Have you thought about this thing? Have you thought about that thing? This character maybe isn't showing this thing, but it seems like they should. And it's really cool to kind of get to do that stuff because I didn't really get to do it before. So I want to talk about that a little bit because I think it's sort of interesting. It's sort of fun to kind of get back to talking to making my writing as best it can be. I talked to Kirsha early on about how this novel is sort of the thing that I put my most effort into. And I really want to make sure that whenever I do release it, that it's the absolute best book that it can possibly be. And I truly feel we are getting there. And I'm even leaving notes for myself at the bottom that are here's thoughts that I've had about this, which is maybe I've realized going to be cool, bonus material for people. Here's author notes about this particular chapter, but also just things about responding to questions that Kirsha asked in her comments, but then also just kind of like just sort of like some initial thoughts about like worries I had or like things I noticed that I'm like, there wasn't really a place to put this thing here, but maybe I'll keep an eye out for it later, which is just kind of cool to kind of have these things that I can go back and revisit later. And I'll definitely let you guys know how that goes when I do end up revisiting all those notes, because I think it will be helpful and I think it will make it the best book it can be. So I really can't wait to kind of like get back into it and finish this book, and then like Kirsha read it again and see like where we're at and what needs to change again and how it can be, really great. So I'm really looking forward to letting you guys read this book, because like it truly has been like a thing that I've worked very hard to kind of like, it's been a long time coming, I guess is what I'm saying. It's been a very long time coming, and I'm just glad, I'm excited to see it in the world and to see like what it can do for like for me, like career wise, but also just like if it can do a lot for people, because like I really love this story, and also like very fun. There's a lot of like comedic bits, and like because like I had a bit of comedic stuff in Tyranny of the Fae, but it was very like additional. Like the characters in Tyranny of the Fae were not the protagonists were not especially lighthearted. But Star, one of the main characters of this book, is like very lighthearted, and it's very fun to kind of like shift that. And like I've had the cover art made for this book, so even trying to think about things like that as I get into it, like the cover art makes Star look far more like himbo-y than I'd ever imagined. But now I'm like, that makes sense. Like it checks out with his character. So I'm trying to incorporate a little bit of that stuff too. So like it's a cool thing to kind of like get into and really, really tweak and make great. All right. So I just want to sort of get into that. Stay tuned. I'll be talking to Arden Coutts very soon. We're going to talk about his career and sort of like his initial books of like sort of these queer romance books, and we're going to get into it. So we'll be right back. Welcome back to Strider Fans. I'm joined now with Arden Coutts, another author, friend of mine that I met at Lavender Con. I've been interviewing a bunch of you guys lately. So how are you feeling? What's going on?
I'm feeling good. I definitely am missing Lavender Con. It was such a great time, and like yourself, met like tons of amazing authors there. So it was a wonderful experience. So, but we've been good.
Yeah, and it's one of those things where I wish I would have talked to like more people. Like I talked to Ryan Gephardt a week ago, and he was one of those people that I didn't get to talk to that much. And it's like I wish I would have talked. I wish I would have had time to like get to know you better at this con. So like I got to know you pretty well because we sat next to each other at the vending booth, which is like probably the place to get to know people because you're sort of like stuck in a place with somebody.
Yeah, it was. I felt the same way. Like there were a lot of folks that I wanted to meet that I didn't get a chance to, and I did spend one afternoon just kind of like walking around and like chatting with folks, and that was awesome. Like it was
Yeah,
wonderful. Just even if it was just a brief conversation, I was like, oh yay, I'm meeting people.
yeah. So tell me a bit about like how you started getting into this. So you can take this either way. You can talk about how you started writing and like what that experience was like, or you can talk about like whenever you decided to start like publishing and like whenever that sort of like, because it's a different thing, right? Because some of us write as a hobby, and then some
Yeah,
of us think people should read the thing that I write, and I should make an effort to make people do that, and that's a different thing, right?
yeah. I think I'm gonna give you a little bit of both, but in a
Okay.
short story, I promise. I won't I won't go on for too long. But I have always wanted to be a writer, which I'm sure you probably hear a lot from a lot of people. But I grew up with my mother was an avid reader, and the library was often my babysitter. So I grew up reading a lot and started writing poetry when I was very young and started like submitting my poetry to I had authors that I loved reading, and I would just send them my poetry in the hopes that like they would help me get published one day. And they would often send back like pamphlets, because this was, before the time of the internet.
Yeah.
So I would find their information in the back of the books that I would read and would send them snail mail, and they would send back information about poetry contests for kids and things like that, and I would submit my stuff. So I've kind of always wanted to publish my work, but then I kind of stopped writing for quite a while. when I was going like high school. I was really focused on sports, and like that took all of my time and energy, and I kind of lost that interest, I guess, in reading as much and as in writing. And then college was like a whole nother beast. And then I eventually kind of found my way back to writing, and yeah, eventually just made the decision. I guess I don't know. It sounds kind of lame, I suppose, but I was just like, you know what, I'm gonna publish. I want to publish this. It's a dream. Like it's on my bucket list, and I made that decision and started taking steps to start publishing in 2020. I think 2022. Yeah, I would say 2020 was really when I was like, I'm doing this. It's gonna happen. And I didn't have a story idea at the time, and that didn't hit me until like 2021 or 22, and that's what became Fall into Midnight, my first book that I published. So that was hopefully that wasn't too long.
No, that's good. And then once you started publishing, like, what was that experience like? Like, sort of like getting into it, starting the promotion, like that whole grind. But then also sort of like, because also like you have a decent number of books, right? And you've only been publishing for 4 years, so.
Yeah, I hit the ground running. I feel like I got really lucky because I had this idea for Fall into Midnight, and I was like, oh my god, like because I have insomnia, so I often tell myself stories to help myself fall asleep. And that's how Fall into Midnight started. I had this idea about this queer bouncer, this female bouncer that falls in love with an ER doctor, not realizing that that was the plot to Roadhouse. But you know what? It works. It works. So I would tell myself this story, and I was like, I have to write this down. Like, this is the beginning of something. And so I was writing Fall into Midnight, and then, in that, I was like, oh my God, these side characters are so good. They have to have their own story. And that kept happening. And so before I knew it, I was like, oh my God, I've got a trilogy, and I've got some side, projects that I might eventually publish based on other characters in those books. So yeah, I feel like I got really lucky in that aspect.
Yeah, it's always a weird surprise whenever characters sort of like come out like that, because I think it's so bizarre, because like sometimes whenever you write like a side character, and I've thought about this because I've been doing some backstory stuff with my book, where I've been going back and writing like full stories for people that like barely were in scenes. But you realize that some characters truly exist in the world just to like stand guard at a door, and like that's the only reason they're in that story, and they're really just there to talk to your main character like a couple
Mm,
times, and that's truly like their life. And then you
yeah.
start thinking about it, it's like, oh, like then they have to have a life, and I need to figure that out. And sometimes you don't, right? Sometimes they truly only ever exist for that function, and like it's fine for the purposes of the story. But every now and again, even those kinds of characters, you'll start writing dialogue, and it's like, oh, I actually really like this person.
Yes, and that's exactly what happened. Because I was like, oh, I need a goofy, sidekick to my main character. I'm realizing I follow kind of the plot line of a lot of like 80s and 90s buddy cop kind of action film. So I was like, oh, I need that like quirky, funny sidekick. And then I fell in love with him, and I was like, oh, Marcus has to have his own story. And oh yeah, it was great to be so inspired by character because I hadn't experienced that before. And so I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. This is what it had a conversation with another author, and they said, you know, I don't really plot. I just let the characters speak to me, and they take me where they want to go. And I'd never experienced that before until I started writing Fall into Midnight. And then I was like, oh, this is what they mean. Like, it was a really cool experience.
Yeah, what I've started doing is I always plot out like a little bit. Like I'll have like a sentence for each chapter or whatever, just to give me
Mm,
like, so whenever I sit down to write, I know like the point of what I'm writing. But I always feel like whenever the characters make decisions that aren't in the outline, and I have to like change things around, that's whenever I'm like, oh, I'm actually doing it. Like I'm really doing it this time.
yeah. Well, I didn't try. I did plot my third book in the trilogy, and that was a whole new writing experience for me. And I actually really liked that process and the way it came out. And I was like, oh, okay, this is why people plot. Like it makes a kind of makes a difference sometimes. So it was a good kind of trial to see about plotting. And now I'm trying to build my first magic system and kind of plot a fantasy book, which is a whole other monster that I don't know if I'm quite ready to try to slay it yet because it's a big task. I'm realizing to like build a fantasy world.
Yeah, and like I'm basically stuck in the world I've been writing. Not I use stuck in sort of a not pejorative way, but like because once you make it, then like there's so many other like opportunities for story that it's like, well, I can't not tell that story now.
Yeah.
So it is sort of funny to put all this work in. Like it always blows my mind whenever there are authors that write like a fantasy or sci-fi book as like a one-off, and then they go
Mm.
on to write other stuff, and it's like, how can you leave? How can you abandon this world?
Yeah, all that time and effort that goes into it. Oh yeah. I feel like I'll probably be the same. I'm like, I built this, I must play in this world for a little while and keep sharing stories from it. So
Well, and
we'll see
you
how that
basically were doing it
goes.
already, right? With the because you said in the same universe as your original books.
Yep. Yeah, yeah, with Fall into Midnight and everything. So yeah, it's really interesting. It's kind of I don't know. I love what we do, creating our little worlds and kind of like playing in them and sharing our stories. It's super fun.
Yeah, and I think it's just kind of it's an interesting way to sort of like observe the world, right? Because like then you have to start thinking about things like whenever you meet people, like little things will stick out, right? And it's like, oh, I could
Mhm.
put that in in a book that I'm writing, or when you people watch, like it's always a great way to like develop, because I rarely will base like main characters around people I've seen in real life, but I will often base like side characters around people I've like seen in real life.
Absolutely. I have a story that I've been writing for, oh my gosh, 15 years, I guess, or some, I don't know, some ungodly amount of time. And I've started releasing it on my Patreon, and I don't know if I'll ever release it wide, I guess. But a lot of the characters in that, my favorite character is the president, but I based him off of a man I saw on the metro in DC that was like, seemed really well put together, was in like a suit and everything. But if you looked closer, you could see like the sheen of sweat on his face and like the seams coming undone on his suit and like all these like little things that kind of gave away that he wasn't as put together as he wanted people to think he was. And he stuck with me for years, and I was like, I gotta put him in a book.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, so I love this idea of the things that you're writing, or like a lot of stuff you write is like an 80s movie, but gay. That feels like a
Yeah.
great selling point for like, because like there's such a like people like nostalgia is so huge now. Like have you sort of like played around with that?
No, and I need to. I need to. I There's a part of me that wants to like really lean into just that 80s, early 90s vibe and just go full force into it. And then there's a part of me that's like, I don't know, I guess I'm probably a little scared too in case it doesn't work out.
Yeah.
but it is really, when I think about what I enjoy writing, it really is that like 80s movie action adventure vibe that I grew up with. Like that is what another part of why I started writing, because I would watch these movies over and over again. Like Backdraft was one of my favorite movies. I can't remember when that came out, but I was quite young. Probably shouldn't have been watching it, but I was. And I loved it. And I rewrote that entire movie, but with a female main firefighter and made it gay. Even back when I was however old, still in middle school, I think. So again, too young to be watching these films, but yeah, it's served me well. But yeah, I definitely think I should lean into it a little more.
Yeah, it's always funny to me whenever, because you see a lot of this online, right? Where they'll try to like criticize like movies becoming more progressive by replacing a lead with like a person of color or a queer person or whatever.
Mm,
And every time they're sort of like, oh, we should make like I don't know, Backdraft, but with a black trans woman. It's like, honestly, that sounds incredible. Like, can we
right?
do
Like, why
that?
are we not?
Thank you for the suggestion.
Yes, yeah. I'm just like loving this conversation because it's like inspiring me so much right now. I'm like, ooh, I'm getting some ideas for like things I want to write now. So thank you.
Yeah. So maybe you could chat a little bit about like I love to hear more about the Patreon thing because I don't think I've talked crowdfunding with anyone on this podcast yet, and it's because I talk a ton about how this job is not sustainable and like you have to like work a full-time job and like really even most big authors have full-time jobs that aren't writing. And but I feel like crowdfunding is kind of like the one area where if you get a decent sized following, you probably could build sort of like an income that you could maybe not live off of, but for sure like comfortably live and maybe have like a part-time job or something so you can still put a lot of time into it. What has that
Yeah.
experience been like for you?
So I just started my Patreon and I am kind of experimenting with it a little bit. I have one patron, which is amazing. I'm super stoked. But I love that it allows me to essentially crowdsource, not content, but they're almost like there to help me brainstorm, which is
Mm-hmm.
really awesome. Like, oh, should I name my main character, one of these three names? And then they get to help me choose. And it's really fun because then they're always going to like know that they were a part of building this world. And I think that's super freaking cool. Like, I wish that was around, like when I was a kid, I would have been all over that type of stuff. But I do think that like Patreon, YouTube, I think authors should have, like if just a day in the life or write with me type stuff on YouTube does great. So yeah, I think there's definitely options out there that if anything, it's extra income that you can put back into your books, which is what I kind of see it as. But I I use my Patreon to pay for other people's Patreons. So
Yeah,
that's what I use mine for.
I think a ton about how like like the old time structure of like having a patron of the arts that just like gives individual artists like just loads of money to just do their thing. It's like
Oh, yes.
it feels like we maybe need to start moving back to that because
Oh my
like
God, yes.
because the truth is I think that for a while like capitalism kind of like allowed artists to thrive and build careers and live, and I think that we've gotten to the point now where corporations have decided, well, we don't need to pay these artists anything. we can just
Yeah.
we can just nickel and dime them as much as possible, where it's just not sustainable, not even for just authors but like musicians talk about this all the time. And like I'm sure like YouTubers or like people that do that like content creators feel similarly about this kind of thing. And it's almost like maybe like Patreon is like the way forward, or that kind of subscription model where like you are, because think about something like Dropout and how like
Oh,
it's so
yes.
popular. And I think it's just because they make very specific but quality content that their audience will continue to pay for.
Yeah, and I totally agree. I think doing some type of subscription is the next step. Especially like I know a lot of artists that have Patreons now that do really well. A lot of authors that are fan fiction writers do amazing on Patreon. So yeah, I'd have to agree. I think doing some type of subscription or like serialized releases of your books. I'm trying to think of the name, but Alona Andrews and gosh, what is it? It's House of Something, and I can't remember what it is. But they release parts of their books in a blog and do insanely well. Like they will release their entire book as a blog ahead of the release of the book and then make small changes and publish the book. And I mean, they do so well. It's really amazing. So I think if you can implement something like that, that's a great next step in your writing.
Yeah, I thought a ton about, because like, a lot of times you'll write a book sometimes like months or a year before you actually release it. So I've
Mm,
thought about, like, when you write your rough draft, you could release those chapters on Patreon. And then by the time
yep.
you edit it, it's going to be very different anyway, because like, you're going to get an editor to look at it. You're going to make changes, all those things. But also like, so like for the writer, it's almost like no risk, because if people are paying for it, it's already, and then, but then I still think for the reader, if they're a fan of yours, like that's cool, right? Like I would love to have
Absolutely.
had, I don't know, like videos of people brainstorming like popular movies and things. Like that would have been fun to have.
Yeah, definitely. And like for example, for November, my goal is to write 10 5,000 word short stories. And I'm kind of I'm dabbling in horror stories, and so this is kind of like a safe space for me to test out that material. So I'm like I'm going to write 10 short stories. I'm going to post one per month in the Patreon. You get all that feedback. And then at the end of that 10 months, I'll have like an anthology of short stories, or not an anthology, but like a bunch of short stories that I can publish if I want to. And I'll have hopefully feedback from readers on what they like, what they didn't like. So it's a great way to test new material and kind of, dabble and see what your readers enjoy and what they don't.
Yeah, and not for another, but I've heard plenty of authors say that short stories are kind of like what they actually love writing more, because you can have a very specific point and story and sort of put an end cap on it. Whereas like a novel is like so much more of an investment, and it's just such a different medium that, because I think oftentimes whenever people are getting into writing, they think of short stories and novels as like almost interchangeable, but like they're super
Mm,
not. They're such a different thing. But I hear that a lot of authors like get a lot of fulfillment out of writing short stories. And also like I think that's the way to get your name out there, because like journals and things like that will publish short stories, whereas like they're not going to publish a full novel, because you can't put it, that'd be the
yeah.
whole magazine.
Yeah, and I do think that, like, at least for me, I find short stories to be a lot more challenging sometimes because I mean, if you're sticking to, I don't know, anywhere from 5 to, we'll say, 20,000 words, and that can be really hard. That can be
Yeah.
really challenging to stay under that word count and to actually tell the full story. And I'm a very wordy writer. Like it is the bane of my existence. Bane of my editor's existence is what I should say. So I'm looking forward to that challenge of like sticking to 5,000 words and being able to tell a full, complete story within that word count. So I'm pretty excited about it. And I've got some great story ideas, and there are horror stories all centered around different holidays for each month. So there might be an evil Easter bunny in there somewhere.
Love that. And I think that's a great tease to kind of like move on to the next segment on. So we're going to take a quick break. Whenever we come back, Art and I are going to be talking about writing trans characters and sort of like broadly representation in media and things like that. Welcome back to Most Writers Are Fans. I'm joined once again with Arden Coutts. And so whenever I first asked you about this, I sent you an email. And for the record, I sent you this when I was like so tired. I was like falling asleep on my grandma's couch, because I'm staying with my grandma these days, here and there. And I was just like falling asleep, and I was like, but I gotta get this email out. This is whenever we had to reschedule. But whenever I sent you that, I was like, I would love to talk to you about like trans characters, because I think it's such an important thing to talk about. But also like, I want you to know that I value you as so much more than a trans person. Not because I think whenever, and it sounds like a weird thing to say, but I think the truth is, when you are who we are, and especially when you live in not like a huge city, like I can envision a life for myself where I only ever speak on panels about bisexuals and fantasy, queer and fantasy, like that's
Yeah,
my entire life. And I think, and you don't want that to be your whole life, but at the same time, I think that especially like trans characters and transness, I think is not written about nearly enough. So I think and also like I'm trying to write a series right now that has a trans character, like a non-binary character as a lead. And I just sort of would love to get some insight and talk about like your approach, what you do, and all those things. Cause I think that we do need more trans characters in queer media, but I
Mm.
think that a lot of people are hesitant to write it because if you're not trans, it's like, oh, I can't do that. But I don't think that's 100% true. I think that if you are immersed with trans people in your life, like you know enough to write a character. So I'll let you kind of like take the lead here, but then we can chat a little bit about how what you've been doing and how to do that.
Oh my gosh, I'm like, oh, I have so many things. So to start with, so I actually moved because I did live in a small town and was the only kind of openly trans individual that a lot of people knew, and it kind of became too much.
Yeah,
And I started to question a lot of it was almost like people were filling out their bingo cards.
yeah,
And I was like, oh, are you socializing with me because you want to socialize with me because you enjoy the person that I am? Or is it because you want to check that, box off of
yeah,
people that you know? And it kind of became overwhelming to the point where I was like, I think I'm going to move. Because it was such a small town. I was like, I got to get somewhere where there are other folks. And so I forget exactly what you said, but that, like, am I only on this panel because I'm X, Y, and Z, or is that all I'm going to ever talk about?
yeah,
Is something that I think about quite a bit. And I am, it's kind of a catch 22. I am very open about my gender and sexuality, and I do put it out there, but I question it almost all the time about whether I should or shouldn't, especially when it comes to like submitting to conferences. Do I include it? Do I not include it? Am I only getting in because of that and
yeah.
nothing else? So it definitely makes you question a lot, just like in your day-to-day being. So that's the thing I immediately thought of as you were talking. And then the other thing that I really want to share is, or I often question if even I should be writing about trans people or transness or, trans characters, just because I want to make sure that I'm doing it right as well. And
Hmm.
I base a lot of my characters off of myself. So I'm usually writing to my own experiences in some way. And I don't know if I need to start putting caveats at the front of my books that say that, but I worry about that as well. And especially in Fall into Midnight, the lead character is gender fluid, which is when I first came out. Well, I've had a long journey of you know, bisexual, lesbian, pansexual,
As is not unusual
pansexual,
for most trans
straight.
people, right? Like a lot of trans people
Yes,
have
gone through the steps of everything, I guess. So gender fluid, and then trans. Eventually, it took me 32 years, but I got there eventually, and it's been wonderful ever since. But I was really, and still am, concerned and worry about whether or not I represented gender fluid people correctly or in a way that makes everyone feel, not everyone, but I just want to make sure I do it right.
yeah.
So
No,
I
I
struggle with that still.
yeah, I think a ton of people worry about that. But the thing that I've tend to notice, and God knows, like there are probably people who do this horribly, but I feel like as long as you do your research, you know people, like you consume media by the thing you're writing. Typically, the group you're writing at or to or about is typically the ones that care the least about your portrayal, and the people that are like progressive trying to be politically correct people are the ones that are going to complain about it.
Yes.
I remember I put my book on NetGalley, and I have an indigenous character, and there's a lot of like indigenous oppression happening because like that's reflects the reality of many indigenous people, and it got like this person like tore into it that was like, this is written by obviously not an indigenous person, and
Ugh.
they're using their oppression for media. And then I ended up getting a bunch of like, because I like freaked out about it because like it was like the first reaction on one of the first reactions on NetGalley. So then I
Mhm.
like freaked out. I went on TikTok and I was like, hey, can I get some indigenous people to help me? Like, I'm worried about this. And then a number of them read it and they're just like, oh, this is fine. Like, I don't mind. And I think it's just like a lot of times I think that like quote unquote woke white people like put way more pressure on this, and
Yes.
sometimes I get this as they go on crusades unnecessarily because they just want to find people to like call out. But typically the people that are in the group that you're trying to write to are just thankful that you are,
Yeah, that you're representing and yeah, sharing their stories. Yeah. Or I always feel like I see even now I'm like, "Oh gosh, am I saying things correctly?"
Yeah,
Kind of it's nerve-wracking to like I know I want to share my story. I will never write like a memoir or anything like that because I don't want, I don't want to. That's not
yeah,
what I'm in into. And so writing stories like Fall into Midnight and my one that's coming out soon is We All Fall, which is an romance. Like sharing those stories is how I share parts of myself. Like especially writing it, I had a lot of doubt writing an romance, a male romance. But there's so much of myself in that book when it comes to the anxiety and the PTSD and the depression that these characters are experiencing. I'm like, this is myself on so many different levels. And I hope people can focus on that and not focus on the fact, or you know what I mean? And like,
yeah,
not
yeah,
because there's this whole conversation around, like, should women or should individuals that identify as women write romance? And that's kind of it. It's the same conversation, and I always just think I'm like, if we only wrote what we fantasy wouldn't exist.
yeah,
Like that wouldn't be a genre. So
yeah.
it's
I think it is really interesting that we've gotten here as a society, honestly. And I want to be also conscious, like this is two white people having this conversation. So like again, being
mm,
very conscious of that. But I do think that like whenever you think about representation, like in my novel that I'm working on that'll be coming out in a year or so, both of the main characters are people of color, different shades of it. But it's not that I feel like I'm representing them because generally their race doesn't come up a ton. But
mm,
like I am just super uninterested in writing about white people because there's so much
yeah,
of that out there already,
yeah,
and it's not necessarily that I feel like I want to represent these people, but it's like I don't want to tell the same stories that have already been told, you know? Like I want to
mm,
find new ways to tell these stories. And like I grew up, with like the WB kind of cast where like it was often like an ensemble cast of people of different races. And I would love for my books to reflect that, because I think that that's sort of like the idealized world where these people can
mm,
can hang out and regularly get together and not feel like they're the token one.
100%. And that's yes, I'm like, oh, I feel that because like I in my series, I kind of wanted to do the same. Like I didn't want everyone to just be white, right? Because that's not the world that we live in. Like so Gray is Asian American, Key is African American, and not everyone's gay, but they're all a little gay. And so, yeah, I just want to be representative and inclusive of the world that we live in, and I think that's important to do. So hopefully that comes across in my work.
But yeah, and I think the other point that I think about a lot is whenever I feel most represented, whenever I first started reading like queer characters, were things like Simon versus the Homo sapien Agenda, written by Becky Abertali, who doesn't identify as bisexual, but she was writing a gay, you know, boy, and but I don't think that it was done in a way that was bad or like
Mm,
non-representative. And I was so thankful that that was out there, for me to consume. And
yeah,
I think that that's like I love Heartstopper, and Alice Oseman is not queer as far as I know, but it's still like good wholesome content that I'm glad exists in the world.
absolutely. And I wish because of where I grew up. And the time I grew up, like I don't remember there being any queer literature anywhere in the library in middle of nowhere, Nebraska. Like none of that existed, and I read a lot of fantasy because something a little different. It was interesting, and it wasn't just all you know normal folk doing normal stuff. I don't know. Now I'm thinking about like queerness and fantasy.
Well, and I think that also like the people like the generations growing up now, like Gen Z, Gen Alpha, I think that they just don't understand the worlds that we lived in, where internet was new,
Yeah.
and like message boards and like Tumblr posts were basically where you got, where you shared information with each other. And like shipping culture wasn't this thing that was like toxic and ruined fandoms like it kind of is
Mhm.
now. It was this thing that like we would try to find little nuggets of queerness in these stories that maybe didn't even intend on having them, but we had to like go scavenger hunt for them to get any
Yeah.
kind of like representation. And I'm glad that we live in a time where there is media being made for diverse cultures and marginalized communities, but I don't think that it's bad that we created those things for ourselves. I think that we've gotten to the point now where people sort of try to like latch onto these like they want to sort of like cancel people because they're writing things that aren't within their wheelhouse. And
Mm.
like I to some extent I get it. Like I think that there should be more black people writing, black characters. Obviously, like I'd love to see more of that. But also like when you're self-publishing, like because you also self-publish, correct? So like
Yep.
whenever you're self-publishing, like we are, like I don't have more opportunities because I'm doing this. You know what I mean? Like I'm not taking it from someone else. I'm
Mm.
doing this on my own for me. So I don't think it's wrong for me to want to then, because I'm not trying to like capitalize on the stories of like, marginalized communities. I just
Yeah.
want to, I want to tell, I want people like that to see role models for themselves. Like whenever I write fantasy, a lot of times my characters are like things that I like. Almost always they're like bisexual or have ADHD or something that I can like latch onto. But I think
Mm.
about how I would have loved to have had that book as a kid to see that. But then also, like, if you make that character a person of color and maybe mention it a time or two, think of how much that could have on a person who is a person of color that is also bisexual and has ADHD, Like how, like,
Yeah.
whenever you are
Huge.
those, like, many different groups, like, that representation is so rare. So, like, why not do that?
Yeah. And I think that's with a lot of indie authors. I think I'm generalizing and I'm speaking for myself, but I think we're really just trying, like you said, to share stories that we wish we would have had when we were younger and kind of sharing the stories that we used to get through,
Yeah.
especially, being, I think we're probably around the same age, kind of like elder
Yeah.
millennials.
Yeah.
We grew up in a time where like mental health wasn't a thing really, or at
Yeah.
least for me. Like, no, I don't think I heard anything about mental health until I was well into my 20s. And I was like, what?
Yeah. I was
Therapists
diagnosed with
exist?
ADHD
What
when I
is
was
this?
32.
Yeah. It's like, oh, okay. Like I can talk to somebody about my feelings. That's great. So I think a lot of the stories we tell are the things that and I think I've said this before, but like, especially, I'm going to use my next book as an example. One of my characters like goes to therapy and has a lot of conversations around PTSD and their trauma, and a lot of what is being said is what I wish someone would have said to me when I was going through that stuff. And so I feel like a lot of us are kind of hashing stuff out with our
Yeah.
stories and want to, make it available for others.
Well, and like I said, I think it'd be different if like I was out there querying and I ended up getting with a big publisher, and then I made no effort to include, the marginalized communities in the making of my product, then I would feel worse about it. But the fact that
Hmm.
I'm self-publishing, I'm not, like I said, I'm not making tons of money on my books, right? Like
Yep.
I'm truly throwing it out there into a black hole that sometimes never may never find its way out. Like that's
Yes,
truly
yeah.
what self-publishing feels like sometimes. So it's like I'm
Mhm,
not taking opportunities away from people. So this idea that like we're trying to capitalize on their stories, it's like, God, I wish I was a little bit, because then I could maybe throw some money at
right? Yeah.
marginalized communities. But like at this point, like I think we're all trying to make it,
Mhm,
and we're trying our best out here, and I think that we should be grateful that we live in a time where, because truth is, queer stories are still very hard to query, right? Like agents
mhm,
still are not just like jumping on them. So
yeah.
like I think that it's important that people like us are self-publishing, because these stories wouldn't exist without that in not many cases.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And this is a kind of on topic, but also this is my ADD rearing its ugly head. But I recently saw a post. I wish I could remember who posted it. It's the author of Reclaimed, which is a trans story, or the main character is a trans individual, and they've been getting some comments about the way they wrote that character. And I think it's important for readers to realize, I guess, that a lot of times a character cannot embody every individual's experience that they have had when it comes to maybe their own gender journey and stuff like that. And so, like, I don't know. I think that's an important thing to keep in mind as well when reading and consuming content.
Yeah, and two, I think like something I think about whenever I think about like representation, not necessarily even not done well, but just that didn't resonate with me for whatever
Mm,
reason. I remember whenever DC Comics made Tim Drake bisexual in like some recent comics. In the comic where he kind of like explores this, he talks about how like he always knew this was a part of himself, or like, but he was just trying to hide it, or whatever. And in my experience as a bisexual person, that's not what I experienced. You know what I mean? Like for me, like I always knew, and I never didn't know. I never
mhm,
denied it. Like I always knew that I was attracted to multiple genders, but I
mhm.
just didn't like, it was more of like I wouldn't allow myself to think about it because of like Christianity and all the horrible reasons why
Yeah.
why we don't accept ourselves. So like for me, I feel like most bi people always know they're bi. And that's been my experience with a lot of bi people that I meet too. Whereas like for a lot of gay people, like they do, I've met a number of gay people that have done that like sort of like suppression thing where they like keep shutting it down or whatever. So whenever I read that, I was like, oh, this is written by somebody who's not bisexual or somebody, you know what I mean? Because like they're trying to describe an experience that they've heard in like other queer media, or maybe it might even be like a gay person
Mhm.
showing their experience. But it's like, well, then why can't he be gay? You know what I mean? Like, why do we need to put him in this box whenever you don't want to check off that box?
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting point too.
Well,
Hmm.
and the reason that I'm interested in like trans characters is I've had a number of trans friends that have like I've seen transition through the years, and like you said, that sort of like multi-step process of like they become bisexual, then they think of themselves as a lesbian, then they think of themselves as like non-binary, then they
Yeah.
eventually you know and some people stay in those lanes as they get there. But I think that transness is just one of those things that it's not even necessarily that it's not well accepted in society, though it isn't. That's a whole other conversation. But I don't even think it's necessarily that, because I think that most people that are like open to it, that are having those transitional moments, are open to the idea of being trans. It's just like it's not always evident to them right away. Like they kind of have to live in these different shoes or these different categories for a minute to be like, wait a minute, this doesn't quite fit. Let me try a
Yes.
different pair. And I've never seen that experience represented in media. Like it seems like every time a trans character is in a show or something, they're like immediately trans and then they
Yeah.
transition, and then we never see like that middle stage. And that's just so not at all the experience that I've ran into with actual trans people.
Yeah, that is a really good point. I'm like searching my mind thinking about trans characters, and you really do often meet them once they've fully transitioned. I find that really interesting. I'm just thinking about that now. Like I'm going through all these different characters. It would be fascinating to include that experience because I know personally myself, I've gone through. like I was saying, like the whole checklist. And I think also like showing the kind of confusion that often accompanies that transition. And even like I'm non binary, and oftentimes I will just find myself sitting and going, am I a man? Am I a woman? Am I
Yeah.
somewhere in between? And
You're
and
like,
it's
oh,
like,
right. That is what non binary is.
yeah, like, and it's something I think about probably way more than I need to or
Yeah.
should. And that's a therapy thing. But like just showing that internal conflict, I think would be extremely beneficial for people who might be questioning or might be, like, oh, well, maybe I'm non binary. And having the language to explain that is also like so helpful, because that's
Yeah.
something I still struggle with. Like people are like, "What do you mean when you say you're non-binary?" And I'm like, "Well, I personally, I see myself as a blob, but like in a good way.
Yeah.
I'm like, I'm not one or the other. I'm somewhere in between, and I'm like a lumpy space princess." So,
Well, and I think that like sometimes you don't know what you are unless you know it's an option to be that thing. You know what I mean?
100%,
And I
yes,
think that is again is getting representation is getting better. That's why representation is important. But also like sometimes you just encounter a person or a piece of media with a character in it, and you're like, wait a minute, I think that could be me. Like I just didn't know that I could be that.
that's 100% what happened for me. Like it was during COVID, and TikTok was blowing up, and I was on like queer TikTok, and all these young people were talking about being non-binary, and I was like, "Oh my god." Like that clicks for me. Like that language makes so much sense. I don't remember what this individual said or how they said it, but it was just like the most beautiful definition of non-binary. Like I get goosebumps talking about it right now, because I remember the feeling that came over me when I heard it, because I was just like, oh my god, that's me. Like I finally understand and like have that language to process who I am. And then like I stumbled upon like top surgery and like all that, and I was like, oh my, you can do these things. It like literally changed my entire world. Like I I don't have the vocabulary, the language to express like the difference in who I was and who I am now. Like it is like worlds apart. And it's because I finally had that definition, and I was like, oh my god, this is it. This is what I've been waiting for like my whole life.
Yeah, I love that. And honestly, I think that that's what bugs me whenever people say things like, "We don't need any more coming out stories," or "We've already had so many coming out stories, we don't need it," because it's like I don't think what people understand is that coming out is different for everybody. Period.
Mm,
But then also, I think
yes.
it's very different for different identities, and we've not seen because I think that a lot of times, and this could just be an element of there's only a gay person in the writers' room for that show, or like
Mm,
they have only ever seen other gay people come out in media, so that's what they're basing it on. But I
yeah.
feel like every time we see it, whether it's a bisexual person, a trans person, whatever, they always do it the same way a gay person often does, which is like having like a coming out conversation. But I
Yeah.
think that for like bi people, it's always like a multi-step process of like, oh, so these feelings are normal, and that's
Yeah.
and I need to maybe accept that part of myself because I've just been like not considering it. Whereas like for a lot of trans people, it's sort of like this multi-step process of like finding yourself. And I think that those kinds of like journeys and those kinds of coming out isn't portrayed like ever really.
Yeah, absolutely. I could not agree more. Yeah. Ooh. Again, I'm so glad that we're having this conversation, because my wheels are turning right now just about what that would look like. Because I've read a couple of books with trans characters, and some of them click and some of them don't. And this kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about like everyone's experience is different. and not every character's experience is going to match your own. But I think some really wonderful things could happen with those types of stories being shared.
And again, it's just because I do believe in that theory of like every story's been told already. I think that
Mm,
like the formula, I think that's true. But I think that they
yes,
become new stories whenever you include people that weren't allowed to tell them. Whenever you tell those same stories, but with different, people that weren't able to be included in them.
wonderful. Yeah, wonderfully said. I was like, yes, yes, Terry, yes.
Well, thank you so much for joining me, Arden. This was a really great conversation. And I, like I said, I think that it's an important conversation that isn't being had enough, especially among queer writers and like the queer literary community. Because I think that it's not even that trans people are getting excluded; is that they're not even thought about, right?
Mm,
And that's the
yeah.
thing that I think is like worrisome whenever you see a lot of these. Because I mean, I talked about how at Lavender Con, like it was cool that I wasn't the only queer person there. And there were, but probably for you, like it was like revolutionary that you weren't the only trans
Oh,
person there.
it was again, and I'm getting goosebumps thinking about LavenderCon because it truly was for me. Just being in a queer space was fantastic. I was like, oh my gosh, like just being around all these amazing, creative queer people. I was just like, oh, this is fantastic because I hadn't experienced anything like that before, and so it was just yeah. Again, I'm like at a loss for words because it was so wonderful.
So if people would like to find out more about you, where should they go to do that?
I am super active over on Instagram, and my username is just at Arden Coutts. That's ARDENCOUTTS. I'm on Facebook under the same name, TikTok, same name. I do have a YouTube, which is under Wandering Creative Life, and my Patreon is also Arden Coutts. So you can find me everywhere.
You could be the second patron. That's pretty exciting.
That's it. Yes, and you will get a personalized shout out from yours truly.
Most Writers Are Fans Day Starlight King production. Special thanks to our guest, Arden Coutts. The audio and video for this episode of Most Writers Are Fans is edited by AJ Kumar. If you didn't know there was video, Most Writers Are Fans has video episodes now. They can be found on YouTube and Spotify. If you'd like to support the podcast, please rate and review it. Also make sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. If you'd like to send a message, record a voice message, or leave a comment, please visit the Spotify page for this show. Find out more at mostwritersarefans.com. You can also email us at press@starlightkingpress.com. Thanks for listening, and until next time, don't be afraid to tell your story.